So you're very welcome with us to join us here this evening for tonight's talk. This talk is being held as part of the Lurgan Townscape Heritage Scheme, which is a scheme which is regenerating historic buildings in the town. So you might have seen a few of the buildings that are currently undergoing restoration work. It's supported by the Armagh City, Banbridge and Crown Borough Council and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. But we're delighted to be joining today with the Lurgan Mechanics Institute, and I have to say a big thank you to Alan and all the team here for hosting this evening's talk. The Institute is of course a landmark building in the town, we all know it, and the team here at the Institute have been maintaining it since 1858, I think. Not the same team, but...
Looks like it.
Yeah. But I have to say it's a real tribute to all the generations who have been here to keep this building in such great condition, for us to all enjoy. Now, despite the fact it is a landmark building, it's perhaps true to say what the Lurgan Mechanics Institute was founded is perhaps a little bit of a mystery. And this evening's talk, the origins of it really came a few months ago when we were having a meeting here and we sort of talked about, wouldn't it be nice just to have a wee talk about the history of the Mechanics Institute? So we sort of done our research, and then we came across tonight's speaker, Joanna Bourke. Joanna has written a book about the very first Mechanics Institute, which was in London, the London Mechanics Institute, which is now Birkbeck University. And it was decided, well, wouldn't it be great to get someone who has written a book about the Mechanics Institute to come here and tell us about the movement? So we sort of sent an email out to her. I wasn't really expecting a reply, and she came back and said she'd be delighted to come and talk to us about the history of the Mechanics Institute. As luck will have it, she happened to be here in Dublin in October, and she's got the train down to be with us here tonight. So, Joanna, thank you so much for coming. Really, really appreciate it. And this is an exclusive, so no one else has heard this talk, so we're very, very fortunate. And I'm going to hand over to you, Joanna, before we're on.
Yeah, well... firstly, people at the back there, if you don't hear me or if my voice dips, don't be shy, just stand up and wave like that and I will raise my volume again. You can hear me now, so I'm starting off okay? Good. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm going to preface my talk today by saying I don't know about Lurgan. I'm going to be saying some things about Lurgan because I'm really fascinated by how the Lurgan Mechanics Institute is so different from some of the others that I do know a lot about, particularly the London Mechanics Institution, which, as you just heard, David just said, was the first. But please, I'd really be fascinated to hear more from people here in this room about what you may know about the context, the local context here. So I'm really pleased to see you, and I'm going to start by going back to 1859, when the Lurgan Mechanics Institute was formally inaugurated. As things happen, sometimes the formal inauguration takes place a little bit after it's actually opened. But when it was reported in the papers that it was opening, in the presence of one of the largest and most fashionable assembles that had been witnessed in the town for a very long time past, the townsmen and women of Lurgan in 1859 were intensely proud of this building, and rightly so. It's a gorgeous building. According to newspapers throughout the North, the Institute was, quote, a handsome structure situated at the corner of High Street and Union Street, opposite to the domain of Lord Lurgan. It belongs, properly speaking, to no one distinct style of architecture, but approaches more nearly to the Romanesque than any other. Due regard has been had by the architects to the purpose for which the building is intended, and the exterior ornamentation has been sparingly employed, but the general appearance is light and attractive, and the pleasing effect is much increased by a beautiful and lofty clock tower. Now, really importantly, when you're looking at mechanics institutes throughout the world, these mechanic institutes are very much local affairs. In Lurgan, it originally consisted of a museum. So there was a museum on this floor, actually, showing off the wondrous industrial productions of the Lurgan looms. In the early years, it had a very strong educational focus. At this time, remember, nearly half of people in Ireland were illiterate, a fact that, of course, was rapidly changing at precisely this moment in history. The library, again based here, which had been formed by purchasing the entire library of the Lurgan Literary Society, contained around 1,200 books when it first opened. Now, for 1859, that's a lot of books. And it tripled its holdings within 40 years. Second floor of the building was schoolrooms. There was a schoolroom for girls, there was a schoolroom for boys, as well, and this is quite important for mechanics institutions, that they offered education for working adults, providing instruction in writing, arithmetic, English grammar, geography, measurements, and geometry. So some of these skills that are necessary for the trade of the city. Okay, what motivated people to establish mechanics institutions, firstly in Lurgan in the late 1850s? In a couple of minutes, I'm going to place the Lurgan Mechanics Institution in its much broader context, global, in fact, context. But I think it is helpful to listen to what people at the time thought that they were doing when they established this institute. The foundational story of the Mechanics Institute in Lurgan, as it was told during the inaugural address in 1859, was that it was conceived of by William Watson, born in Lurgan, successful linen merchant in New York, very successful in New York. He returned, in other words, from America with this fortune. And in the words of Lord Lurgan, sportsman and Presbyterian Charles Brownlow, who was chairing the event, Watson's, quote, keen eye, prompted by the feelings of a kind heart, at once led him to perceive that there was much to be done for the amelioration, both in mind and body, of the hard-working men, the weavers. He felt that those industrialist mechanics, by the way, mechanics in this period is not what we think of as mechanics, it just means someone who works with their hands. Those industrialist mechanics by whose skill and industry he had attained his present honourable and affluent position was not advanced. Indeed, Watson went on, they were scarcely holding their own in this age of progress. So that's what he wanted to do. Train the mechanics, the weavers, people who worked with their hands in Lurgan, so they would be part of this broader progress that he believed was happening all over the world. By charging only 2 shillings per quarter, it was hoped that the Institute's classes would, quote, place knowledge within the reach of all who were really anxious to acquire it. Now, these sentiments were echoed, in fact, time and again during that inaugural address, which was given by, the address itself was given by 77-year-old Francis Blackburn, Lord Justice of Appeal and Chancery in Ireland. He was as passionate a supporter of the Church of Ireland as he was an enemy of Daniel O'Connor. Blackburn believed that Lurgan's Mechanics Institute was the means of advancement and permanent improvement in matters that must, more or less, affect the welfare and happiness of all that will place themselves within the sphere of its beneficial influence. He believed, this is Blackburn, he believed that the Institute would increase the comforts and improve the condition of those who take advantage of them, including, most importantly, having a beneficial influence on the moral habits and conduct of the working people of Lurgan. Okay, so both Lord Lurgan and Francis Blackburn acknowledged that the physician and philanthropist George Birkbeck and the legal giant Lord Brougham were the original founders of the movement generally. The movement in Lurgan, as elsewhere, was animated by George Birkbeck's passions. These were the need to extend education, I believe in the importance of useful knowledge, and that useful knowledge is really important in this movement, and a conviction that only education would not only enhance people's intellectual capacities, but, and this was just as important for them, their moral and spiritual behaviors as well. So the first half of the 19th century was a time, as we all know, of intense economic, political reform. Civil society itself was undergoing revolutionary changes. Industrialization was transforming relationships between the different orders, by which they mean classes. Even the most conservative employer was beginning to realize that, we actually need an educated or more educated worker than we already have if business is to flourish. This was especially the case in industrial centers such as Lurgan, where the economy was dependent on the skills of workers. Economic competition, particularly from continental Europe, was a great concern to these industrial owners. Governments were beginning to tackle elementary education, especially after the Education Act of 1870, which provided compulsory education. But it was believed that these mechanics institutes were at the heart of education more broadly than that. So, what is this movement? Well, the father of the movement is George Birkbeck. I work at Birkbeck University of London. That's founded by him. Although classes for, now he was the first to establish mechanics institutions, but of course classes for people, working people, had been founded prior to him in the 18th century. But the systematic establishment of mechanics institutions can be attributed to this rather interesting man. 1799, George Birkbeck had been entitled to teach natural philosophy and chemistry at the Addisonian Institution in Glasgow, which had been founded 3 years earlier. So the founding story, the founding myth, if you like, of why George Birkbeck did this was one day he needed a particular machine for his class. He visited a mechanical workshop and was struck by two things. Firstly, by the mechanics' absolute ignorance about what they were doing. Basic engineering facts. And second, by their hunger for knowledge. So what did he do? He promptly opens up his classes to working men. Saturday evenings. Birkbeck's aim was to ensure that a working man would cease to be a mere machine, toiling on from day to day, but would understand the laws on which his operations were based, and therefore perfect himself in his calling. Demand was high. By the fourth class, there were over 500 mechanics in the room. George Birkbeck left Glasgow for London in 1804, where he set up a very fashionable medical practice, but he also set up a medical practice for the poorest of the poor people. He was a Quaker, really quite a good guy. He threw his energies in London into a variety of social and political causes, including support of the Reform Act of 1832, which transformed the electoral system, gave a lot of working men the vote. But also, and this is one that a lot of us don't seem to think is important, but he really fought to repeal the duty on newspapers and on paper. Why was this important? That tax was severely limiting the ability of people to contribute to political debate and disseminate knowledge. 1823, patent agent Joseph Clinton Robinson and economist Thomas Hodgson, along with the radical tailor Francis Place, put out a call to establish a London mechanics institution, and George Birkbeck, of course, was considered to be the obvious president for this. He brought not only sort of radicalism, but he also brought huge respectability on all political sides, if you like. By the middle of the 19th century, when Lord Lurgan and Blackburn were giving their inaugural orations to the members of the Lurgan Mechanics Institutions, there were an estimated 610 mechanics institutes throughout England, 55 in Scotland, 25 in Ireland, 12 in Wales. Institutes, by the way, were also flourishing at this time in New Zealand. Ta-da! I'm a New Zealander, by the way. In New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Canada, the US, as well as other places. Now, if George Birkbeck was the founder, Henry Brougham was the movement's philosopher. Brougham, he's a lawyer by profession, but he came to public notice because of his role as the chief advisor to Queen Caroline, the estranged wife of King George IV. By the 1830s, Brougham was Lord Chancellor of Great Britain, where he too, active supporter of the 1832 Reform Act, active abolitionist, the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act. And in 1826, he founded the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. Crucially, however, his book on education was just a top bestseller, entitled Practical Observations upon the Education of the People, addressed to the working classes and their employers. It became, without any question, the key text in mechanics institutions everywhere. First year alone, Practical Observations went through 19 editions. In Practical Observations, Brougham contended that only tyrants and other bad rulers should be terrified by the progress of knowledge among the mass of mankind. He maintained that the time is past and gone when bigots could persuade mankind that the lights of philosophy were dangerous to religion. He argued that the peace of the country and the stability of the government could not be more effectively secured than by the universal diffusion of knowledge. These sentiments were echoed by commentators, mechanics institutions in Ireland. In the words of the Ulster magazine, 1861, the Mechanics Institutes aim to illuminate the understandings and reform the habits of the mass of mankind, creating useful citizens. The author, that word useful, by the way, is just ubiquitous in all of the mechanics institution literature of the time. The author rejected the idea that men who are engaged with engrossing occupations, toiling at their daily task, and often for their daily bread, were uninterested and incapable of discovery. Instead, he insisted they were keen, and just as important, they were capable. They had brains. The honest rewards of patient industry and the heaven-descended flames of genius are confined to no order of our fellow beings. He also believed that democracy demanded it. As the Ulster magazine contended, the masses were already increasingly influencing governments, meaning that it was in the interests of all classes to assist in diffusing the seeds of knowledge and enlightenment. The greatness of this country has its foundations on a volcano. And if an eruption should arise owing to any revulsion of our social system in these days of impending commotion, the calamity would be all the more mitigated in proportion as the people should be found tractable and intelligent. So in other words, he thought that we're living in troubled times. If the volcano explodes, civil unrest, education, knowledge is going to be a way to keep things in place. He argued that men who joined the mechanics institutes understand that they require more than the bread that becometh stale and more than the meat that perisheth. The mind needs the food that nourisheth as much as the body refreshing support. Now, these were idealistic expectations. They were not shared by all. Mechanics institutions worldwide, including here in Ireland, faced exceptionally high levels of hostility at the time. Opponents had 6 main concerns. First, were working men and women capable of learning? In the early 1860s, an anonymous author in the Ulster magazine admitted that when a young man is tired after a hard day's work, it is by no means pleasant to set out after tea to come to some mechanics institute and sit shivering for an hour or two in a barely furnished room while a third-rate teacher tries to unravel the intricacies of English grammar. Second, there were anxieties about whether women should be part of the movement. Now, in Lurgan, Emily Ann Brown, daughter of John Brown, the 3rd Baron Kilmaine, along with 31 other ladies, organized a bazaar which raised a huge sum of money for the time to help establish this institute, the Lurgan Mechanics Institute. As her husband, Lord Lurgan, announced during his inaugural address in rather patronizing fashion, the ladies proved themselves most efficient salesmen. Laughter and applause, we are told, happens. But, you know, okay, ladies are one thing, but what about ordinary women in Lurgan and elsewhere? This was highly, highly contentious. Few people disputed that education and domesticity should be or would be very, very useful indeed. For example, the Mechanics Institution in Lurgan introduced cookery classes. By the way, they introduced different ones for the higher women and for the lower women. 1879, readers of the Lurgan Times were told that the matrons and maidens of Lurgan are no less alive to a sense of their own interests, probably those of their menfolk, I would have thought, but anyway, than women elsewhere. It was generally admitted that a little education in domestic cookery was much required by the matrons and maidens of Lurgan. By charging only 1 6p, it was hoped that instruction would be within the reach of the most humblest members of society. But what about educating women in other topics? There were mixed views. On the one hand, would the presence of women in mechanics institutes lend to immorality, as unchaperoned women wandered the corridors, mingling with men in the same corridors? Would the scientific quality of the lectures be diluted, since maybe women would just want leisure-type activities, such as art and music? This is an art class. On the other hand, would educating working women, would educating working women enhance their employment opportunities as teachers, as artists, teachers of music? Would it promote more fulfilling and more equitable relationships? As early as 1826, prominent Owenite William Thompson pleaded with mechanics institutes to let your libraries, your models, and your lectures be equally open to both sexes. Equal justice demands it. Long have the rich excluded the poorer classes from knowledge. will the poor classes now exercise the same odious power to gratify the same antisocial propensity, the love of domination over the physically weaker half of their race. So it's all part of this idea that we need to make women rational companions of men. They would raise rational children. Their domestic labor would benefit families, communities, nation. Third, might educating working men be detrimental to good morals? John Dumlett, a Scottish Justice of the Peace, maintained that a literary and scientific education would not generate that change of heart required in Scripture, nor would it advance morality to a sublime pitch. Scottish essayist and priest Archibald Allison expressed similar sentiments in much more vivid terms. He argued that educating working men would give them the means of gratifying the animal or sensual propensity. Allison agreed with the philosopher Francis Bacon that knowledge or education is power, but it could be power to do mischief as well as power to do good. And similar concerns were expressed about Irish mechanics institutes. Was the Lurgan Mechanics Institute respectable? Looking at you. There were complaints about improper and filthy language heard in the amusement rooms of the Institute, with one commentator begging the committee to make a distinction between liberty and license, calling for good breeding and gentlemanly demeanor. Similarly, in the early 1860s, an anonymous author in the Ulster magazine snarked that a little knowledge was a dangerous thing. He claimed that at the meetings, let's see if this rings any bells. At the meetings, there was often a great deal of talking for talking's sake, controversy in which neither side is much interested, being merely got up to pass the time, and the bad jokes and the bad grammar which prevail are sometimes truly terrifying. It is almost needless to say that such meetings seldom, if ever, entice young men from scenes of dissipation. Now, he did think there were ways to remedy these problems, making people pay for the lessons, making them sit exams, handing out presents and stuff like that. The fourth concern expressed by opponents of the Mechanics' Institutes were that they were a threat to religion. Churchmen and their supporters feared that any education that was primarily scientific and philosophical rather than moral and religious was risky. As conservative biblical scholar Edward William Grinfield warned, it would be far better that the common people of this country should remain totally illiterate than that they should be furnished with tools by which they would inevitably work out their own and public ruin. And a great concern in all of these institutes, but also here in Lurgan, which I've got lots of evidence for, is what books are you going to put in the library? And novels, should novels be allowed at all? Because they lead to dissipation. Theological concerns were augmented by more practical ones. The fifth and sixth anxieties related to the establishment of mechanics institutions were that they would foment social and political disorder. Some commentators alleged that there was a link between education and crime. The more education there is, the more crime. Look at France, they said. The possibility, yeah, good point. The possibility that educating working people would incite social unrest, however, paled alongside this idea that it would create political chaos. Of all the arguments against mechanics institutions, this was the most vocal. For Moses Angel, who was active in the Jews' free school movement, the Mechanics Institute were an improvement on the tavern, the billiard room, the cheap theatre and the casino, because they at least attempted the cultivation of the minds. However, he went on, they risked turning half-educated men into ill-formed politicians and therefore generally revolutionists or at least democrats, which for him was a bad thing. For Angel, democracy was a threat to social stability, was as big a threat to social stability as all-out revolution. One critic, and this is my favorite, one critic even contended that educating working class men was as perilous as educating animals. Suppose, this anonymous author in the Edinburgh Review wrote in 1826, suppose that some friend to humanity were to attempt to improve the condition of the beasts of the field, to teach the horse his power and the cow her value. Wouldn't that make the animal less tractable and useful, and not so profuse in her treasures, he means milk, not so profuse in her treasures to her helpless child? Once again, useful knowledge was equated with knowledge that maintained the status quo rather than questioned it. And it was linked to increasing concerns about weakening deference of the lower orders towards their superiors. In the words of one author writing in 1825 in the St. James Chronicle, every step which they take in setting up the labourers as a separate and independent class was a step towards destruction. He continued, a scheme more completely adapted for the destruction of this empire could not have been invented by the author of evil itself, the author of evil, the devil itself. Now, this barrage of hostility towards these mechanics institutes and other institutions of this period failed to dent the momentum of reform. Yay! After all, the institutions were part of a much larger movement of social improvement. It's important, I think, to reiterate the point I made at the start, and that is that mechanics institutes were very much local initiatives. Indeed, I actually think it's problematic to talk, as I have been doing, of a Mechanics Institute movement. They were established by local communities. They served local interests. The institutes in Australia and Ireland can be taken as an example. In Australia, they were mainly rural institutes. Their buildings were much more than libraries or reading rooms, which is what the London Mechanics Institute was. They were meeting spaces, galleries, theatres, venues for sports, fairs, weddings, baptisms, funerals. These broad functions were also true of mechanics institutes in Ireland, including this one in Lurgan. Like in Australia, they are often located in provincial towns. Many were inspired by temperance politics. I had a wonderful image here, and I forgot to add it to the one I sent you, David, of these women from the Mechanics Institute looking really glum, and a sign behind them says, lips that have touched the wine shall not, lips that have touched the bottle shall not touch mine. Anyway, but they were very much part of, meeting places for local communities. The Lurgan Institute was also a major centre for local entertainment, although it wasn't licensed until 1969, I believe. Probably due to the temperance, lips that have touched the body shall not touch mine. Throughout its history, billiards was routinely, from the start, billiards was routinely mentioned. As with many of these mechanics institutions, they had a bank, penny savings bank, who was accommodated in this building rent-free. This happened in many of these institutions, and indeed one of the largest banks in England was the bank that was founded in the Birkbeck Mechanics Institution. In the words of Blackburn during that inaugural address in 1859, the Lurgan Mechanics Institute, saving banks were an invaluable boon to the vast multitudes who were paid for their labor either by wages or small salaries, because they gave working men a safe investment for their money. So this is the very early days of saving banks for working people as opposed to the wealthy. It was a moral enterprise. Specifically, it was a moral enterprise to prevent or to reduce intoxication. Blackburn asked his listeners to picture to yourself the condition of a family where this laudable economy are practiced, and contrast it with what you unhappily too often see: the fatal waste of the fruits of labour on intoxicating liquors, go to the ruin of body and soul, and to the penury and wretchedness of those on whose comforts they should have been expended. The local character of the Mechanics' Institutes inevitably stirred pre-existing tensions, and one of the major ones in most of the mechanics institutions around the world was who was to benefit. Some, such as the Yorkshire Union of Mechanics' Institutes, were dominated by the workers. Others, such as Bradford and Lurgan, were very much top-down. And this was to tear the movement apart. I'm going to explain this by looking at what some commentators say about whether the Mechanics' Institution are a progressive force or not. The Northern Whig called the institutes in Northern Ireland a glorious work of national unity. And indeed, the Institute in Lurgan proudly proclaimed time and again that it was established for the scientific, literary and social improvement of the operative classes of Lurgan and its neighbourhood without distinction of creed or party. This, of course, was not to be. There were two highly interrelated issues that caused tempers to flare: religion, no surprise there, and class. Accusations of sectarianism were prominent. 1879, the Lurgan Mechanics' Institute had insisted that it was the, quote, only place in Lurgan in which classes of the community could meet on a common platform and on a purely non-sectarian basis. But that was patently not the case. Institute of Lurgan may have claimed this, but there was actually in those early days a strong anti-Catholic bias. Some commentators, including the Institute's chairman, even suggested that the failure of the Institute even suggested that the non-sectarian nature of the Lurgan's Institute was the reason why it had failed to flourish, unlike other places. Class was the second and, of course, highly related issue. These class tensions were not unique to Lurgan. It was a very big thing in the London Mechanics' Institute and many others as well. As early as the first mechanics institution, this is the one in London, there were heated debates about who should have power. Should it be the operative classes, the benevolent rich who were giving the money for these institutes, or should it be the members themselves? And it almost tore the London Mechanics' Institution apart. In Lurgan, these tensions, these class tensions, reached a crisis point in the early 1880s. Membership had dropped hugely. There were only 125 members in the early 1880s from thousands when it was established. According to the Lurgan Times in 1881, this was causing financial distress. When members of the Institute failed to support the plan to raise subscriptions to 10 shillings from 5, which they believed would help with the crisis, the financial crisis, 12 members of the committee stood up and walked out, leaving only Lord Lurgan and 2 other members of the committee in their seats. The failure to raise the subscription rate drew attention to the fact that the class for whom the Mechanics' Institute was established were absent from the actual institute itself. There's a long version of this, which I'm going to give to David here, if you want to read the long version. A new committee was established that set about, this is the early 1880s, set about radically overhauling the entire institute. This included downgrading the centrality of the library, which had, according to the papers, ceased to exercise the slightest attraction to any reader, and was described as in a state of total disorder. The new committee believes that the way to attract mechanics and artisans was to provide more entertainment, by which they meant billiards, chess, and draughts. To do this, they needed a good room as opposed to the small anteroom, so the reading room was converted into, which I assume actually was converted into an amusement room, and funds were made to support this. The plan didn't wholly work. The renovations didn't wholly work because you keep hearing similar criticisms, particularly in the 1890s. A person simply signing himself a worker complained that the Lurgan Mechanic Institute, quote, has been monopolized by the class that needs it, by the class who require it least, and who have made it into a 5-shilling club without popular instincts of any kind. And this author wanted to establish the Lurgan Free Library. The Carnegie Library, of course, was established in 1910, and in 1945 purchased the entire library of the Lurgan Mechanics Institute. Reflecting on that purchase, so it's going in steep decline here, reflecting on that purchase, someone signing himself, we know it's a man, himself, pro bono publico, commented. This is 1944 we've jumped to now. Commented, "The power of the written word is uniformly known and respected. The Nazis, since their rise to power, have sought to destroy all the emancipating literature they could seize. The importance they attach to good books is revealed by their diabolical eagerness to destroy them." He continued, stating that this was why the guardians of Lurgan purchased the library of the Lurgan Mechanics Institute, so that in time the library shall become a seat of culture, wielding a beneficial influence on the community, for which high purpose libraries were first constituted. So just to conclude, I've got 1 minute. In 1859, the Lurgan Mechanics Institute has been formally inaugurated in the presence of one of the largest and most fashionable assemblies that has ever been witnessed in the town. But it struggled, like so many other mechanics institutes, to adapt to changing educational provisions and social as well as political realities. The people for whom the Mechanics Institute had been established were, without a doubt, becoming less deferential. In Lurgan, as early as 1884, they reported of a lecturer who was with tiresome prolixity, arguing that art cannot improve nature, and he was interrupted by a chorus of people in the audience exclaiming, "Well, what would you look like without your wig?" State-run education, good on people of Lurgan, state-run education from 1870 in particular was also, but also from the 1940s, was also really important as taking away one of the main rationales for a lot of the mechanics institutions. In places like Lurgan, class and religious tensions had a deadening impact. In the words of a writer in the Lurgan Times, 1884, comparing the Mechanics Institution to that in England, the Irish had more deeply rooted and intense caste instincts and a magnetic repulsion between class and class. The fundamental purpose of the old Mechanics Institutes was in disarray. Were they vehicles for social mobility? Were they key to improving or to promoting the entrepreneurial ideal? Was the spread of the institutes due to the enthusiasm of local people wanting to improve their position in life? Or was it more about social control of the workers by their betters? Nevertheless, around a half a century after it had been formed, the Mechanics' Institute in Lurgan found itself, as they put it, the last of its kind in Northern Ireland, since all the others had already faded away. It was a major achievement. Thanks.